Hello, it's Scott Manley here, back with another round of questions from my supporters over at Patreon. Yes, you guys have always been asking some really fascinating questions, and well, I kind of like to answer them. But I first of all want to lead off by saying I'm kind of sorry that I haven't been uploading quite as much as I have in the past, and that's largely because I've got another project on the side. Some of you might have guessed when you saw this flight yoke here, or maybe you caught sight of one of these like little flight computers. Yeah, basically I'm actually sort of getting off my butt and properly learning to fly rather than like video game simulation flying. I mean, sure, I can put planes down in simulations with some accuracy. That's a long way from actually having a private pilot's license. So yeah, I am knee deep in aviation manuals and other stuff, and hopefully we'll have some actual footage of me actually flying planes sometime soon. But with that being said, I will continue to upload. I just haven't having the huge amounts of time needed to do some deep research on interesting subjects. But off-the-cuff questions from supporters that I have lots of. So yeah, we're going to start off with Katrin, who says, I just watched an old video of yours regarding decontaminating spacecraft before it's sent to other planetary bodies in order to prevent interfering with any potential existing biospheres here. Link to the video. You mentioned that there's an international treaty detailing what spacecraft have to be decontaminated and how. If anyone flies humans to Mars, that's basically out of the window, right? Because there's no way you can decontaminate a human in the same way that you can decontaminate a spacecraft. And this is a fundamental question that has to be answered. And, you know, we're running out of time to solve it, hopefully. Hopefully the time to get people to Mars isn't getting longer, right? I'd like to think we're running out of time to solve it. Yeah. Like, even for the spacecraft that have gone to Mars, it's been very clear that some of the spacecraft that weren't quite as decontaminated are being kept away from places, or were being kept away from places where there was a good chance that there might be, there was a chance that there might be water or something like that. So yeah, for humans, there's a two-way contamination issue as well. Like, if you look at the Apollo program, they were concerned about everything. You know, if you had an Apollo program, it had tons of money, and there were people who were like, I want to make it my thing to make sure nobody brings moon flu back. And that's why when the astronauts landed, they went into this decontamination quarantine facility and stayed there for a couple of weeks to make sure that they didn't actually get sick. I did a video on this over at the USS Hornet. Now, for sending humans to Mars, I honestly think that very early on, you're going to have people not landing in highly sensitive areas, because as we're understanding the planet Mars, we're starting to get a better handle on where might be good places to look, where might be isolated, right? And I think that there's going to be a lot of, thought given to the actual landing site, partly because there's going to be constraints on where the vehicle can land. Like, the northern hemisphere is easier because it's much lower and the atmosphere is thicker. So they're going to have to factor that in. They're going to have to factor in the known geology, and then they're going to have to make a hard decision as to whether to allow humans to go near sites which have potential life on them. I think there's going to be a whole bunch of robots that go there before then, and it's entirely possible that they answer this question first. And once the question is answered, then the question of contamination becomes less, because one of the main arguments against contaminating the environment is that it means you can never prove that there was indigenous life. But once you get there and prove it's there, that's less of a strong argument. Yeah, anyway, lots of questions to be answered here. Boy, what an open-ended first question. Chris Mills says, Hi Scott, I'd love to hear more about hypersonic flight. So would I. Both powered and boosted glide flight. It sounds like this is pushing the boundaries of material science to the limit, and I'd be keen to hear your take on scramjets and gliding lifting bodies. Seems like Eugene Sanger concepts are alive and well and looking for a home. Yeah, I actually did a Kerbal video about Sanger's Silbervogel, right, Silverbird, which was a hypersonic bomber he proposed during World War II that would boost out of the atmosphere, skip across the Atlantic, drop bombs on New York, and then sort of skip glide across over to Japan. But, obviously after the war, he turned himself to more civilian activities, and he worked on like hypersonic aircraft, although he was involved and proposed, hypersonic aircraft. His concepts were really influential in the people that developed like the X-15, the Dinosaur, and even the space shuttle, right? But right now, for actually flying people on hypersonic vehicles, there aren't really that many options. Like Skylon are talking about their mixed mode engines. These are essentially engines that are low altitudes. They can take in atmospheric air and then burn that with a fuel, and then as they get higher up, they turn into rocket engines. That's not going to carry people by any means, but that is a formidable challenge to solve. Like, I guess the other, so scramjets, you very specifically say scramjets. And those have been something that have been around as a concept for a very long time. Like the ramjet, that was solved fast, but scramjet means supersonic combustion ramjet, where you're using the forward motion of the vehicle to compress the gas down into the combustion chamber and then adding the propellant. Now, in a regular ramjet, you use like shock and inlet shaping to slow the air down so that the combustion happens at subsonic speeds. Having the air not slow down enough that you can have combustion and pressurization, that's a lot more difficult. And so while they had this idea, going way, way back, it only really happened for real in the 21st century, right? Like, so in the X-15, they had a test scramjet, but it wasn't really a scramjet. What it was a sensor package that was just there to determine whether the aerodynamics, like the compression heating, would behave as was predicted on paper. So this was mounted to the X-15, boosted up to its flight speed, and it actually caused shockwaves that damaged the vehicle. And that particular X-15, I don't think it ever flew again, right? I think it might have actually cut off the jet, the module. And, as you go forward in time, like in the 80s, like Reagan gave part of his speech was like, oh, we're going to fly from New York to Tokyo in 2 hours. And that was sort of the project called the X-30. I think it was another like Rockwell, and there's all these cool videos showing this. There was no technology at the time that could get anywhere near this, and it became very clear within a few years that they had a lot more fundamental technical problems to solve. It wasn't until like 2001 that a scaled down version of this, the X-43, actually flew and was able to generate thrust and fly at hypersonic speeds. More recently, I think the most successful one is the X-51 Wave Rider. Hypersonic speeds, you're not talking like traditional, wing physics. It's basically a wedge that's hitting the air, and it's almost entirely Newtonian lift. But yeah, those have flown for like 3 minutes or more. But all of these things are really looking at developing weapon systems that can fly and change course in the atmosphere, rather than carrying people. The only company I've seen that's really looking at hypersonic vehicles with people on board is Hermeus. And they're like one of these little scrappy startups their whole thing, they have a fun little podcast, by the way, which is mostly like people from the company sitting around and revealing secrets in fun and interesting ways and telling stories. But they have a bunch of old J-85 jet engines, which are very old engine, but they're old and reliable. And they're going to wrap it in like a whole new like bypass ducting and like a new inlet, a pre-cooler, like an afterburner or a jet burner or whatever. And they think that they're going to be able to build a passenger plane that flies at Mach 5. And go for it, right? I don't know if they can do it with that amount of budget. I don't even know if their like turbine-based combined cycle thing actually can work, but they know a lot more about jet engines than I do. So I would love to see them make it happen. I get really excited when I listen to their stuff because it seems like at least they know what they're talking about and are prepared to go out on the edge of the envelope to explore parts of jet propulsion that haven't really been looked at too much. Moving onwards. Wow, we're taking a long time here. We're going to have to speed things up, right? Jesse Rutt. Hi, Scott. With Battlefield 2042 coming out, Yeah, this was posted a while back. I was wondering how close you could theoretically get to the business end of a rocket without any sort of injury. Will the noise of the engines make you go deaf before you even get close? Obviously, this will vary with the size of the rocket and the thrust produced, because yes, I've accidentally stood next to a small, like, model rocket that went up, and it was surprising, but it made me spill my drink, but yes. No, I mean, the thing about rockets is the bigger they get, yeah, the more sound they produce. And once you get to really big sizes, you actually start to reach the volume limits of what can be carried in air. You know, there's sort of basic physics about how deep the pressure wave can go. And if you've got like a pressure of 1 atmosphere, then the maximum peak and trough is like, 1 atmosphere. So there's a limit of how much energy you can put into pressure waves. Having said that, I think like the Saturn V, I think it's over 200 decibels, whereas our flimsy human bodies are going to start getting damaged around 140. Actually, the hearing will probably get damaged before that, but you can cover it up and protect yourself. So obviously the closest people to the Saturn V business end were the astronauts, but they were on board a spaceship. They were about 100 meters away. And yes, there were people, if people were unable to clear the pad and there was an emergency which could cause a potential conflagration or explosion. I don't know if you know this, the Saturn V pads, they had this escape slide that slid into a bunker, or like a bunker that was on rubber supports that would isolate it from shock if there was going to be like a huge explosion. It's really cool, but I think it's now actually closed off permanently, which is, yeah, that's a shame. They still kept it around for the space shuttle, but I don't think it was considered to be part of the solution. Yeah, I mean, like NASA during the shuttle and Apollo, they would have people stationed within about a mile of the launch pad. Like they would have emergency personnel, firefighters and things like that. But the closest I've seen photographs and images, I've seen handheld cameras about 100 to 200 meters from a Soyuz. And I would again imagine that they are having hearing protection because just simply that amount of energy is a lot of low end. One of the things about rockets as well is that, or one of the things about sound damage is that it's the high frequencies that damage your ears more easily. The low frequencies just tend to reverberate in your body. So you can actually have really loud, low frequency vibrations that like feel amazing and still keep the high end at a low enough level that you can't, you don't damage your hearing. This is what you learn as a DJ, by the way. This is why bass heavy music is like the stuff. You can really make the room physically move and vibrate if you've got a good enough sound system and still, and still not damage your ears. I don't know, what was I going for? Yeah, anyway, yeah, I'm going to say like 100 and something meters is still totally reasonable if you have good hearing protection. Okay, Gordon Ross. At the moment, the size limit of an object in orbit is the launch vehicle's fairing. Has there been any research into building flat pack modules for space? As soon as the space shuttle started flying, some of its earliest missions were looking at construction in space. They started building like towers out of the truss segments in the payload bay. So yeah, construction in space of more complex things has been a thing for a long time, but just like literally unfolding as well. The James Webb Space Telescope is a fantastic example of something that folds out to a very large size. Yeah, doing more construction in space is going to be in our future, I would imagine. The more that you don't need to have something carefully folded away and can be built by some hardware in space, that's going to solve a lot of problems. I know the Voyager space, the guys that were originally behind the Von Braun space station, one of their actual sort of concrete demos was they wanted to demonstrate a robot that was welding together a truss in space, which is useful beyond their planned space station, right? So yeah, construction in space, very important. Flat pack, I'm not sure. I guess you have to build some pieces here and there. Okay, Simon K. The SpaceX Dragon Crew 3 launch has just been postponed again in the past. by a few days due to bad weather in the abort zones, but there's also a solar flare on October 20. Wow, I haven't answered this since 28. Oh my god, I really need to be catching up. Was there no danger to the astronauts? No, there wasn't any danger to the astronauts due to solar radiation. After all, there were people in space at the time and they're well inside the Earth's magnetosphere. It's not a big deal. And yeah, look, we did see recently a bunch of Starlink satellites that never made it to their final orbit because of solar radiation messing up the outer atmosphere. But that atmospheric drag is really very, very small. It's only a big deal if you happen to be a satellite whose only mode of propulsion is like an ion electric thruster. Okay. Yeah, wait a second. Oh wait, so there was one other question. It's like, what are the chances of returning with superpowers? Yeah, not very much, but I do like to think that my space beers, right, my spacecraft, which is made from hops flown on the Dragon, and my ground control that was made with yeast flown in space, I'd like to think that those came back with superpowers to justify their premium value. Oh, Phil Duckworth. If when Scotland get an orbital launch site up and running, which is looking more and more likely by the day, would you consider being a guest of honour at a launch there, invitations permitting, etc.? Absolutely. I would totally go to an inaugural launch at a Scottish launch site. I would probably fly across the Atlantic just for that. But let's be clear, I wouldn't be a guest of honour because, let's face it, the people that are actually working on the rockets, those are the real stars. They're the people that actually do this for a living and understand it. And they could probably tell me a million things that I don't already know, which is really, yeah, I would love to go. That's all I'm saying. Todd, just Todd. Scott, when planning a mission to the outer planets, do I have to formally plan my path through the asteroid belt to mitigate the risk of collision? Are the asteroids so sparse that the risk of collision is way below the threshold of other risks I am already ignoring? They look so dense in your Asteroids versus Time video, and according to C3PO, the odds are approximately 3,720 to 1. Yeah, Empire Strikes Back. Love that movie. Love the asteroid belt scene. It really changed my direction in this world to really being fascinated by asteroids. Totally not realistic, right? Asteroids are incredibly sparse. Yes, I have this, really high resolution map of the solar system showing all the asteroids and they're all blending into one, but each of those pixels is 1,000,000 kilometers wide. It's huge, right? So even although there are a bunch of things there, they are really spread out in space. If you throw a space probe through the asteroid belt, the odds are it will not hit any object and you don't need to worry about it. To make something like exists in The Empire Strikes Back, I don't know how you would do that, right? You'd have to have some sort of weird Lagrange point that was loaded up with a bunch of stuff that was kept very close together. Still, it makes for a thrilling scene in the movie. And Drew Granston actually added a follow-up. I wonder how they avoid or manage these risks in missions passing through Saturn's rings. Have there been any near collisions of spacecraft with asteroids, moons, rings, or particles? So, first of all, there haven't been any there haven't been any spacecraft that have had to change course because they were worried about hitting an asteroid. It's like, oh, we found an asteroid, we're going to have to steer around it. No, never happened. Although, when OSIRIS-REx was getting into orbit around Bennu, they did get these images showing like small rocks being thrown off the surface. And there was some question of whether they should change their orbital insertion strategy to account for this. As it happened, this apparently occurred during a government shutdown, so NASA wasn't able to respond, so they just went ahead and did it, and it was all fine. For Saturn's rings, well, Saturn's rings are extraordinarily thin. They're like 1 kilometer to 10 meters thick or thin in some places. It's wild. You can see shadows cast across these, and people estimate how thick they are. But yeah, they've made, so there's this sort of transition region from the inner edge of the rings where the atmospheric drag of the tenuous outer atmosphere of Saturn and the magnetic field starts to strip things out of the rings very, very quickly, and they tend to deorbit. And they've actually moved Cassini through that space many times as they were bringing it down to deorbit. And I don't think it ever hit anything. I'm not even sure if Cassini had a micrometeor detector, but although, given that it was expected to go close to the rings, I would think that would be the case. Like, spacecraft essentially carry these like vibration detectors. They're called micrometeor detectors. They're basically microphones, right? And spacecraft have detected these things. So yeah, they do happen, but no spacecraft has ever seen an object and then taken action to avoid it. A natural object, like. Peter Solfist, thank you so much for your science videos. I was wondering if you've heard of any actual development for Mars base leveraging SpaceX's Starship. Yeah, no, that is not happening anytime soon. SpaceX is working on the problem one step at a time. Other people have been looking at the possibilities of living off Earth for a long time, like going back to the moon-based designs in the 1960s, right? And the moon-based designs, they actually came from the military originally. There's of course this great study on weapons in space to defend your moon base from the space Russians on the space moon base, right? So none of that stuff ever turned into anything beyond paper studies. There have been mock-ups like built to like, let's look at the ergonomics of living in a very small space, like a large pressurized rover. There have been like humans factor studies where they basically put people in simulated bases and have them live there for months on end, carrying out a mission on Mars. Long-term habitation, it's mostly people looking at the technologies like oxygen production via decomposing the carbon dioxide into oxygen and carbon monoxide. That's what the MOXIE experiment on Perseverance is doing, and I think that works just fine. So yeah, nobody is building any of this stuff soon, and I think it'll be a fair amount of time before we have to really tackle that problem. John Smith. How much damage does a rocket exhaust usually do to the pad it launches from? I'm sure hypergolic exhaust is pretty corrosive. What about others? Actually, if you get your mixture ratios right, then the hypergolics tend to break down very, very quickly. I'm not curious how well SpaceX's complicated rocket catching system is going to stand up to the massive rocket exhaust. Frankly, I'm not concerned about the rocket catcher and the rocket exhaust. I'm more concerned about the big rocket coming down, several hundred tons of material that has to be carefully caught, because that is going to have kinetic energy, and that's far more likely to damage the pad. We have seen in the past pads getting damaged by the high pressure gases, like and flame trenches, like usually due to just degradation of masonry and things like that. But if you are building a launch pad, every time you launch, you're going to take a look at what's breaking and you're going to fix it. And very quickly, you're going to refine it to a system that works pretty well. But it's certainly not unknown for things to get damaged and designs to get changed as a result. Samuel Voss. Elon's always talking about nuking Mars, but there's a bunch of Trojan asteroids just sitting all clumped together out in the orbit of Jupiter. Would these have any terraforming value if we could redirect them towards the red planet? Well, sure. But Trojans, so yeah, I've said this in the past, nuking Mars is probably not the best way to do this, simply because the nukes will tend to be like on the surface, you might have to drill them down, whatever. Like, the amount of energy you're going to get from a nuke is way lower than the amount of energy you're going to get from an asteroid impact, and you can do that without involving nuclear devices. Trojan asteroids, I guess, are an interesting option because since they sit at the Lagrange point, you can just sort of push them off that point and then swing them by Jupiter and bring them down. So the energy required isn't huge. However, Mars is pretty close to the asteroid belt, and I'm sure there are a lot of Mars-crossing asteroids that are going to come close naturally, and they just need a tiny nudge to put them in the right way. Yeah, having said that, if we're concerned about contaminating Mars with biological stuff, I think it's a long time before we start dropping rocks on the planet. And yeah, if we've got people already living on the planet, I'm not sure dropping asteroids is going to work either. Yeah, I still say that dropping asteroids on Mars is a way better way of melting its ice caps than using nukes. Safer all around in general, and yeah, just a better bang for your buck. Yeah, that's a bit, I don't know how far we are into this, but that's 10 questions or so. So I'm going to say goodbye. Thanks for your questions. I'm going to keep watching for the good ones, and yeah, fly safe.